guys can work for each other. There's a lot of responsibility. But yeah, you can experience, get on stuff, do the ropes, always trade out the on my business is $30. You know, before I think it's it's a hard sell to get on everybody. Alright, thanks.
Have a good time.
Is it?
It's really cool.
Got my Wi-Fi, but I'm not getting anything. Let's make sure it's on. It's on. So it says, one way of proving guilt was concocted in the late 15th century by officials of the city of Oldwater Holland. The suspect, most often a woman, was dressed in a white shirt and put on a special scales. If her weight was less than 99 pounds, then the suspect was found guilty of witchcraft. So guillotine. Dr. Guillotine's the one that developed this to be a more humane way of executing people back in the late, I want to say 18th century? 17th century. 16th century, actually. No, 18th century. But it became more of a tool to execute your opponents until Napoleon Bonaparte restored civility to the French society. When I was in Paris, I visited the place where they had all the names. Concordia, I believe. Well, Concordia was actually where the plaza, the Concordia Plaza was actually where they executed them. But the prison, I forget the name of the prison, but it had all the names on the walls. And it was just incredible. Any name that was in black, those were people that weren't executed. And then all the names that were in red were people that were executed. And it's just incredible to see it. When you see it plastered on the wall, and it shows the family trees of the generations of people that went to the guillotine. They wiped out entire family trees that no one would no longer exist from that family line. The Jacobins did. All for, being political. All they did is switch powers from monarchy, and they took the power and did the same persecution. And it's just incredible. It was over like 17,000 people they sent to the guillotines in that, whatever that is, year and a half, 2 year span. Crazy stuff. Crazy time to live in. Especially if you were in France and you were an aristocrat. And what is his name? I think it's, I forget the cat's name that led it. He eventually went to the guillotine too himself. By his own peers. They eventually found him guilty of treason, and Pereira, or whatever his name is, I don't remember his name. But I do remember that what he did say was that he was gladly to give his life for the liberty of France. Robespierre, I think his name was, Robespierre. This is pretty neat, interesting. The Nuremberg Virgin, wow. So to get you to confess in medieval times, there are a lot of things that they would do to you to make you confess. So you can see why people would confess to anything just because of the torture, because they felt that by torturing you and like hair filleting you alive would give you a more, how should I say, honorable death in God's eyes. It would redeem you for your sins, that you had paid for it in this life and you wouldn't be paying for it in the next. So the bloody eagle, where they filleted your back, the Iron Maiden, they put the spikes in, and were kept inside of it. I don't know if you can see this. This GoPro's not that good. It comes so dark. Very, very sadistic. The Fiat Adam ties. So this vice that kept you in this position, in a worship position like that. Just imagine being in that for days on end. How excruciating that would be. Here's a multiple stock for, it looks like for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. You put 5 people in the stocks here. So the bottom part's for your feet. And then you can see it has, I guess you can do your hands, because the one in the picture doesn't portray that. It's portraying something different. I guess they crossed them, because you see how some of them are bigger than the others. So I'm thinking some are legs, some are hands, so you could be just sitting in a position, both of them locked in there. Here it is. The real stretch you out. Stretch your ligaments and all your joints out. Very cool. Like I say, you know, it was a religious society, and their belief was, I mean, it can't be justified, but I'm just telling you what they believe. I don't condone what they did. But the belief, because since it was a merger of church and state, and mainly the people that did this were priests and stuff, are related to the church as instruments for the church. Elders in good standing. They felt that it was their God-given duty to purge the sin out of you so that you wouldn't burn in hell. And they would burning at the stake. Jeanne d'Arc. So this is what's your name? Joan of Arc. That's what this is portraying. 1412 to 1431. My history's kind of hazy. It's been a long time since I studied medieval history. But that's who this is supposed to be portraying here. Joan of Arc being burned at the stake. And then eventually she was canonized and became a saint for the Catholic Church. But they burned her first. for being a witch, for being evil. And this is back when France was torn between Spain and England, and they were fighting for the territories there, and all they had was a dauphin. He's considered royalty, but he wasn't the king outright yet, to where France was really truly a nation. It had its own sovereignty, and this is in its development stage. Because right after this, eventually the monarchy line came into play, and France became a major player. I got a lot of interesting stuff here that they used to use. So these guys really did their homework on this. Look what it says here at Burning at the Stake. It says, this execution spread from ancient times in different parts of the world, which is true. It goes back to the ancient world. People have been burned either alive for sacrifice to the gods, or were burned after death because their ashes went up to heaven to be always with the gods. That's the way that the ancients saw it. But it says here, the execution spread from ancient times to different parts of the world. The main victims of the flames were military prisoners, apostates, and sorcerers. It was employed at the beginning of the Inquisition and reached the height of popularity by the end of the 15th century. According to various sources, during the Inquisition, upwards of 35,000 people were burnt. Among them was the heroine of the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc. Shackles. It says here, this was used to limit the mobility of prisoners in prisons, mines, and galleys during the Middle Ages. The weight of the load varied from 5 to 25 pounds. Currently, they are still used in countries throughout Africa and Asia. So it's still used today. A lot of people don't think we have slavery today. We still do. You still have it in Asia, and you still have it in Africa. But it's nothing noteworthy for the news, so they don't really. Slavery has been with us since the dawn of time. So it says here the Spanish boot, which is this guy right here. That's the Spanish boot. It says used for torture and interrogation in Europe during the late Middle Ages. This boot had screws that would be tightened to break the bones of the feet one by one. It was popular among the French and British inquisitors. So somewhere in here, I guess the screw went in here, but I don't see the rest of it. It should have had more. The ones that I've seen in pictures, to where it can go around it, and then they just start tightening it down. Here's another variation of it, a longer one of that. But I just think these are replicas. I don't think this is really one. I think pretty much everything here is a replica that somebody made that's good at metallurgy. I think they just made these copies. It looks like, because just by looking at the welding here, trying to hide it. Yeah, they do intact, so. But still, very interesting. All right, the rack. Here we go. This is the press here, where they press you spikes on either end, on the bottom and on the top. They put you in there and then they compress it to get you to confess. Look what it says. It says, press crushing execution. Execution by pressing has been known since ancient times. The convict is placed between two heavy loads or beneath a heavy load. The victim is crushed by extreme force. Often the press are additionally equipped with sharp spikes, nails, or hooks for greater damage. Various modifications of the press served as an instrument of execution in ancient Asia, Africa, and Roman Empire. Crushing execution was still practiced in the 19th century. So if you want to talk about Rome, I do know a lot about Rome. So Rome uses this technique, but this is one thing that's the difference between Rome and other societies. Rome did not have prisons. Like a lot of people think that they see in the movies, that there's these prisons in Rome. Rome did not believe in prisons. They had jails. And they took you before either a magistrate, or if it was a military tribunal, you were meted out your justice and you were executed immediately. The only ones that were held in these jails for long times were victors of the spoils, meaning whenever they were going to have a triumph or a conquering general, they would retain people and keep them in there until the triumph was upon them, and then they would parade them out in front of all the people up to the Temple of Jupiter, and then they would be executed there, strangulated in front of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. So, but Rome did not really like torturing people. Their execution was swift and fast and less special circumstances. The majority of the people were either sent, if you were criminals, you were sent to the, well, in later days you were sent to the Colosseum, because in early Rome there wasn't a Colosseum. So magistrates would mete out the justice. The imperator, which was the commander on the field at the time, which would be the general, would mete out justice. People would be retained for any conquering. Like Caesar, when he conquered Gaul, he retained Jason Veterix and his most higher upper followers, and they were kept in, I want to say, the city jail for at least, the maritime jail for at least 3, maybe 4 years before he had his triumph for conquering Gaul. And then of course he was paraded out in front, and at the end of the line, when they got up to the Capitoline Hill, they were all strangulated and executed, and they were basically, given to the god Jupiter for sacrifice as an offering for the Rome's victory. So Rome was a little bit different. Yeah, they used torture, but I think their worst torture would be, of course, what everybody knows is crucifixion, where it took several days for you to die. They'd hang you up on wooden poles and break your legs so that you can't stand up, so the weight of your body hunches over and puts pressure against your lungs, and that way you basically suffocate to death over several days. Very excruciating way. That was probably one of their most worst ones, but that was held for non-citizens and criminals. And even on a non-citizen, it would have to be probably something like something that they really did that was really serious to offend the state. But most of the time, people were just executed. And especially if you're a Roman citizen, you had the right to a fast death, which was beheading by the sword, was considered an honorable death. Slitting your wrist, if you were an aristocrat, you could slit your own wrist if the death was passed upon you. So that's just a little tidbit. There's a lot more to it, but that's just a basic rundown. So they got the iron pear here. It was invented in the 16th century by the French robber Gaucheroux. Designed to be inserted into an orifice, and then opened once deeply inside, it would then tear the anus or vagina. Wow. I tell you, these guys really took their stuff seriously, man. It's crazy. And they got the wooden phallus here. It says the tool was used by inquisitors and jailers in medieval Europe and Asia, used to violently penetrate the vagina. It would cause tearing, internal bleeding, and rupturing of internal organs. And then this one says it was an anti-masturbation ring. It was used in the late 19th, early 20th century. Wow, so that's rarely fairly recent, by piously moral parents to prevent teenagers from sexual self-satisfaction. I don't know how the hell that thing worked, but whatever. That's it. Well, I just don't know. Never heard of that one before. Alright, so what do we got here? The Spanish horse. It was used during the 14th to 18th centuries in Europe and Japan. Initially, the horse torture. Alright, Spanish horse. Another thing about Rome, yes, if they did, they'd sentence you to the mines too, for basically labor, to mine minerals throughout their empire. Too, that would be another sentence for a criminal also. Spend your days, rest of your days, breaking rocks, digging in mines, you know, anything to keep the empire going. Signed to ships to row oars, to row a ship. So there's many different types of punishment. So let's read this again, see what it says. It was used in the 14th, 18th centuries in Europe and Japan. Initially, the horse tortured women who were accused of heresy and witchcraft. However, after it proved its effectiveness, it was also applied to men. Famously, the Italian Maddalena Lazzari was tortured on a wooden horse for 8 hours, even though she confessed after just 3 hours. So you can see they put weights on your feet to stretch your joints out, put off circulation. Very, very uncomfortable. Stretch your hips, all your ligaments. And then on top of that, you would have metal spikes when your legs are being pressed into that. Very, very, I don't know if you can see that. Very uncomfortable. Torture by insects. So here where they put you in a bucket, fill it full of whatever type of stinging or poisonous insect, and let them have a field day on you. It says, since time immemorial, people of different cultures have used torture by insects of prisoners of war, spies, murderers, and rapists. This execution was called scaphism. In African and South American countries, the victim was coated with honey or sugar syrup and stretched on stakes in the way of ant migration. In Siberia, people were planted directly on an ant hill. In Cambodia, poisonous spiders and scorpions were set on prisoners. Alright, here we have the vice for the hand and the head, where it crushes the bones in your fingers and in your hand and crushes your skull to make you confess and to purge the sin out of you after you confessed. Like I said, they're religious people, man. And it just goes to show you what happens when religion rules. What they do to people. And I mean, it was a different time. You know, it's hard to say here for us to judge them, because that was the time that they lived in. It says the vice for the head, they were used in the same way as the vice for the hands in the 15th century for the interrogation of prisoners. According to some sources, it is still used today in some countries of Latin America for coercion and interrogation. Whew. Pretty interesting. So you got a fidelity belt there for a woman. That's an awfully small one. So often called chastity belts, they were used from the 15th to 19th century in Europe. Knights going to a campaign would put these belts on their wives to protect them from rape or extramarital sexual affairs. And then the men had one also. They had a fidelity belt too that they would wear. These were used from the 15th to the 19th centuries in Europe. Knights going to campaign or monks hoping to remain pure put these belts on themselves to restrain themselves from unwanted sexual contact. So these are all different styles of them. Apparently it looks like chastity belts and fidelity belts. I'll tell you, the ingenuity just goes to show you that they use their brains more than we do today. They didn't hardly have any distractions, so they could think a lot. Witch bathing. Let's see what this is, though. Colombian necktie. Not sure what that is up there. I don't know what that's up there is. Can't really make it out. But I don't think the Colombian necktie needs to be explained. Everybody knows. So witch bathing, that's where they dunk you in head first into, it says it was a popular medieval in America during the colonization as a method of conducting an investigation on a person suspected of witchcraft. The person was dunked into the water, and if she drowned, then they were posthumously declared innocent. Oh man, you'd have to die to be proved innocent. But if they survived, they were burned at the stake for serving the devil. Wow. So there's the whole setup. You know, what's interesting is when you talk about Satanism, witchcraft, and all this, people don't really understand what they're dealing with there. Meaning people that are, you know, so-called Satan worshipers. Yeah, they think that they're worshiping Satan, but they're not. They don't understand the, how should I say, the depth of the field of what they're getting into when you're talking about Satanology. So this is the violin of gossipers. It says in medieval Europe, people were forced to wear this device as punishment for gossip. Wow. And slander, named for its similarity to the famous musical string instrument. This punishment was carried out in public. Anyone wearing the violin attracted the attention and ridicule from people passing by. So this is for gossipers. People don't realize the worst sins, really the worst sins that you can commit. I mean, sin is sin. Apparently, you know, that's what the church was proving here with all these tortures. But the worst sins in the top 5, gossiping is one of them. Maligning, gossiping, pride, murder. I think murder is the only overt sin that's in the top 7 of sins. That's the only overt one. The rest of them are all mental attitude sins if you study theology. But in theology, what they talk about in Satanology is that, how should I say, human good is, how should I say, it's not divine. I don't know. It's you'd have to read it for yourself. It's just interesting on the concept here that they think that they're doing good for God here, and they're not. They're doing evil. That's what I'm trying to tell you by what they're doing to these people. They think they're doing God's work, and they're not. Wow, these are cervical traps. Listen to this. They have been used all over the world since the ancient times for holding and escorting especially dangerous criminals. They are still used on prisoners in some countries today. Sharp spikes and clamps have been replaced by electric shock devices. So when it says cervical clamps, what these things are, this goes around your neck, the back of your neck, and then the chain comes around the front where your throat is, and it keeps you, they keep control of your body. Same thing here. This one actually looks like it hooks into the back of your neck, right at the top of your shoulder blades. So here's some spears, but you can't really see them. It's too dark, I'm sure. This is interesting. I can just imagine the pain these people went through having this applied to them. Wow. Regular stocks. It says they have been used for thousands of years to mobilize and deter rebels, deserters, and those sentenced to public ridicule. It was usually for lower class. It was widely used in Europe during the Middle Ages and in America during colonization. In 2012, in South Africa, a woman was kept in stocks for 72 hours for adultery. Can't really see this, but these are the scold's bridle that they would put on your head and attach it. Very uncomfortable. What do we got here? Shackles, different types of them. Huh. So this is for your wrists, legs. It says they are still used throughout the world to bind the hands and feet of prisoners. The earliest examples date back to the Bronze Age. Alright, so the GoPro died. It overheated the second time. So it says here that they were used as early as the Bronze Age, all the way back to the Bronze Age. Still used today. Different types of shackles. Oh man, this is how they would get you to confess too. Strap you up. Here's the claws that they would use to rake your flesh with. It says the Spanish tickling cat's paw. So let's see what this says. It says this tool was widespread in the Middle Ages. With its help, heretics, thieves, and unfaithful wives were punished. The metal claws penetrated so deep into the flesh that they separated the muscles from the bones, thus caused unbearable pain and anguish. Death, however, would come mainly from infection, since the claws were almost never cleaned. Ooh. There we go. We got the mask of shame. So bridles of gossipers and mask of shame. They say when you study theology, sin is sin, but there's 7 abominations that are the top high-ranking sins. And the first one is pride. The second one is gossiping. And third one, lying. Well, actually, third one is murder. Fourth one is lying. There's only one overt sin. And then strife is the fifth. Where you spread strife amongst your neighbors. What we got here? It says branding with a heated iron. Okay, so this is what they branded you in different parts of your body. And this is the brand, the table of truth, torture, and the tickler. So they burn your feet with the branding iron, the bottoms of your feet, use the tickler on your back, and then they'd stretch you on the table. Wow. I tell ya. The evil that people do to people. Burning of the eyes. It says right here on this one. This cruel torture was used by the wild tribes of the Dark Ages and was adopted by military concentration camps in the 20th century. In 1043, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Monomach took prisoners and blinded 800 Russian soldiers, and the 12th century Archbishop Calix II blinded his rival Pope Gregory VIII. Okay, so where else we gotta go with this? Let's see, I know I missed something. So pretty interesting. I sound pretty, I'm a lot rusty on medieval history. It's been a while since I studied it. But the torture methods were perfected throughout the low Middle Ages, the Middle Ages, and the high Middle Ages is when they really were perfected. Through the different inquisitions. And like I say, all societies use torture. I mean, it's even still used to this day, just in different forms. But these guys in the Middle Ages, they thought it was their religious duty to purge the sin out of people. So that way their soul could go to paradise and not end up in hell. That's why they were so violent, and they believed in what they did. I mean, it's obvious to us today that it wasn't right, but that's just the time that they lived in, because they were a religious society. And it wasn't just in Christianity, it was done in the Muslim world too, and it's still done in the Muslim world today. It's still practiced. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You know, that doctrine is still used. So all societies have been affected by it. There's no society that's innocent. Man, my cell phone does a lot better filming than that GoPro. Look how good the Iron Maiden looks. You can really see it. You can even see inside it. You know, one thing that I don't see here, which is really big, especially in the 1200s, is drawing and quartering. And that was used forever. There is no drawing and quartering. Oh wait, look. Oh no, that's not drawing and quartering. They're just chopping heads off. They're executing. But they would draw and quarter people. They'd stretch them out first, either with horses or hang them to stretch out their joints, to tear all their ligaments and their joints and their elbows and their shoulders and their hips and their knees and in their ankles right off the bat. And then they'd drop them down. And then if it was a man, I don't know if they ever practiced it on women, but I know they practiced it on men. They'd take their virility. They'd cut that off first and throw it in a basket for all the public to see. And then they would open up their stomach and start pulling their intestines out while the person's still alive, watching all this happening to them. And pull the intestines out 1 foot at a time. Until once they got up to the heart, and then of course at the end of the ceremony, they would quarter them up, cut them up into 4 pieces, and chop the head off, and then the torso, and then the legs, and so on, and send them to different parts of the empire to let people know this is what happens to people that rebel against the authority. I don't see that here in this place. I've already walked it all, and I don't see drawing and quartering in any of this. And it was widely used. Widely used. I wonder why they didn't touch on that. They pretty much have everything else here. Let's go back over here. Same thing as the henchman, the one that chopped people's heads off, thought that it was his duty, that was his purpose from God. Oh, guillotine. Dr. Guion wanted to have a quick, merciful death instead of having people suffer. And then this turned into the exact opposite. Because the intensity of leading up to before you go to the guillotine, parading you out before all the public through the square, and just the how should I say, the whole festival that was made out of your death as you were executed in 17th or 18th century France. Medal for drunkenness. Another way to combat alcoholism was introduced by the Russian Tsar Peter the Great in 1714. The offenders were forced to wear a large medal weighing 17 pounds anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. Barkeepers and tavern owners were forbidden to serve anyone wearing this medal. Wow. That's interesting. The barrel again. Putting a prisoner in a barrel of cold water was meant to be a deterrent. As a rule, was the public punishment for alcoholics and brawlers in ancient Rome. Criminals were put in a barrel with excrement while forcing them to dive under the threat of chopping off the head. Wow. It's pretty interesting. And like I say, I pretty much have everything here except for drawing and quartering. Here's the ball. You just have to drag around with you. Alright, but that was no fun. The stocks. Put you in a public square after you were judged. Pretty cool. So this is weighing the witch. Talked about this earlier. So if you weighed less than 99 pounds, you were considered a witch. Wow. And you got to remember, back then, women weren't as big as they are today. Neither were men. The average height in medieval times was 5'2". 5 feet, 5'2". Women were probably around 4'8" to 4'10", maybe 5 feet. That's why Robert the Bruce, William Wallace stood out amongst other men on the battlefield and were considered abnormal, because you're talking they were 6 feet. They were huge. I mean, just look at the armor. If you ever go to England or go to France, and the armory that they have, the historical museum that they have of the Army Museum over there in France, you can just tell most of the people that wore the armor were small. I mean, yeah, you had a few here and there that were abnormal and they were above the average size, and they had to have special armor made for them. But yeah, this is a pretty detailed display of what they would do to you in medieval times. The only thing I see missing is drawing and quartering. And the reason why they pulled the tongue out is, like I told you, it goes back to that sin, a lying tongue. So they're doing you the favor by pulling your tongue out. You can't lie anymore. And then they got to purify you from that sin, and that's why they torture you to death. It's because purifies the sin out of your flesh before you die. Very interesting. Oh, I think they do to you in this one. Wow. This is crazy. Oh, here's the torture by snakes. I just didn't see it. I walked by it. They'll throw you in the bag with a bunch of snakes. Torture you. Poisonous snakes. So these are decapitation sword and axe. Decapitation served to execute state and common criminals for several millennia. Even up to modern times, it was utilized all over the world, especially in medieval Europe and Asia. The axe was most often used to execute commoners, while the sword was reserved for noble criminals. Okay, this is how they kill you here. You would think that it's going to choke you, but what it does is it drives this spike into the base of your neck, of your skull, and cuts your brainstem and kills you. That's what it does as they tighten it up. It says first appearing in Spain during the 18th century. It was used as an alternative to the gallows. It was first simply a stick through a loop in a strap or rope that, when twisted, would result in strangulation. Later, the loop was replaced by a sharp spike and was used until the end of the 20th century. Last execution by this method was carried out in Andorra in 1990. Wow, it's not too long ago. They were still using it. In Spain. So here's where they'd stretch you out and cut you open. Put you on the rack. See what it says. It says bench crucifix. It was used by inquisitors to interrogate and torture prisoners. The victim would be laid out on the bench and their limbs would be strapped tight against the wooden bars with a rope. The executioner would adjust the tension in the rope, which constricted the wrists and ankles of the victim. Sometimes this would cause necrosis of the tissues and irreparable damage to the limbs. Irreparable damage to the limbs. You would never walk again, basically. If you survived this, you would never walk again or use your limbs again how you did before. There's basically cutting off the hands for stealing. It said this kind of torture enjoyed popularity among the jailers of medieval Asia, Europe, and pre-Columbian America. There were many ways to inflict damage to a suspect's hands in order to get necessary information from him or confess his guilt. This type of torture is still used in some countries of the Middle East. Chest with body parts. Wow. People who committed particularly severe atrocities were sentenced to dismemberment. So that's what I'm talking about. Sometimes the executioners would kill so many people a day that they had to put the severed limbs into wooden chests so they could quickly keep their workspace in order. In England, dismemberment was used until 1820. See, in France, this practice was carried out with the help of horses. So they'd use the horses to stretch you and then stretch your joints out like I talked about. Tie one rope to one leg, one to the other, put a horse on each end, and then one arm to the other, and stretch you out, and then they'd start dismembering your body while you were still alive. Gotta remember, you weren't dead. They wanted you to suffer. Sawing, hand saw. Ooh, very excruciating. You got to remember, the person isn't dead. The person's alive while they're doing this. What would ultimately happen is, yes, a person would die from it. But in the beginning of the process, they'd just be screaming in pain as they're cutting into their flesh. Of course, the guillotine again. Here's where they'd roast you over the rack, get you to confess. The gridiron. So it says, this type of torture device is usually described as an ordinary metal grill 6 feet long and 2.5 feet wide. It was mounted horizontally on its legs in order to be able to make a fire underneath. A man would be shackled to the gridiron, making it impossible for him to stand up. Lying on this grill, victims receive burns from the hot metal and open flame. Christian St. Lawrence was tortured on a similar grill. There's another breaking wheel. I already saw a couple of them earlier. So let's see what it says here. It says, the wheel was popular in ancient times and in Middle Ages as a form of death penalty. The wheel was used in ancient Rome. During the Middle Ages, it was widespread throughout Europe. In Germany and in France, it was considered one of the most painful and shameful executions. Here's the guillotine, but it doesn't say anything about the guillotine here. But it's here. see this, but this is where they leave you hanging, stretched out in the cell. Oh, wow, okay, so we got more. This is where they boil you in the pot. Alright, so let's start over here. Let's see what this one says. It says the first mention of this execution refers to ancient Egypt. Boiling alive was mainly to punish disobedience to the pharaoh. Sometimes entire families were executed in the cauldron. There are historical records that show Genghis Khan executed his enemies in this fashion. In medieval Japan, it was used primarily for ninjas who were captured. In 15th century Europe, counterfeiters were subjected to a similar brutal death. So pillory. In medieval Europe, the pillory was a common form of public punishment for violations of moral standards. The height of its popularity was during the 18th century in 1703. The writer Daniel Defoe was put in a pillory, but being beloved of the townspeople, he was pelted with flowers instead of rocks and rotten food. Gallows. It says execution by hanging has been used since ancient times all over the world. Enemies of the state, murderers, robbers, and rapists were hanged. Today in Asia and in several states of America, such as Washington and New Hampshire, hanging is still a possible death sentence a criminal might receive. The last person hanged in the U.S. is Billy Bailey, who was executed in 1996 in Delaware. So this is what they call, I guess, a manual guillotine. Let's see how this one works. It says, through the 14th and 18th centuries, criminals were deprived of their lives by the use of hand guillotines. This process was terribly painful. The condemned man placed his neck through a hole in a wooden plank. The executioner hit a heavy wooden wedge placed on the back of the neck with a large hammer again and again. The sharp side of the wedge would tear the flesh and crush the vertebrae, and the victim died. Wow. I guess this was used out in the field, you know? There's the pike. They put your head on it, they chopped your head off. So we have different ones here. The stork. The first mention of the stork is found in the book Italian Chronicles by Stendhal. It was actively used by European jailers for torture. A prisoner chained to the stork had to sit for hours and hours in a twisted pose. This brought on pain and cramps in the muscles. Wow. Flute of shame. I guess it's going to be this guy right here. It says the device is similar in design to the violin gossipers, was used in the Middle Ages to punish musicians for a bad performance. Special holes for gripping the fingers make the tool look like a flute. Not even musicians were immune from torture. And then the violin gossipers. It says this device was used to mildly punish the defendants for slander and spreading gossip. Like I told you, gossip is high on the list of sins. It was popular in Europe during the Inquisition due to its simplicity and effectiveness. The punishment was applied to common people. So the prayer cross. This is the prayer cross right here. It says it was used to slowly torture prisoners during the Inquisition. According to some sources, it is still used in modern China. There have been cases where criminals died from being held in the anchor for too long. So there's a prayer cross used in a different formation. Alright, well, now we're getting into filleting and dismembering. Hanging. This torture spread all over the world from ancient times and the Middle Ages. Hanging was performed in various ways. Hanging by the limbs, passing the rope through wounds on various parts of the body, and even piercing the ribs or the genitals with a hook. In modern times, some countries that do not comply with the Geneva Convention's ban on torture will still subject prisoners to hanging. Excoriation. Even in the chronicles of ancient Assyrians, Aztecs, and Chinese, there are references to the filleting alive of captured enemies or rebellious rulers. Ripping the skin from their body was sometimes used as a part of public execution of traitors in medieval Europe and was practiced until the early 18th century. The double violin gossipers. It was used to punish two women who had a public quarrel, forced to sit opposite each other for hours. The squabbles often managed to continue the argument at first, but after a while they got tired and quieted down. Here's where they'd use the rat. Put it on your chest, genitals, to easily your flesh. And these were hungry rats too, they hadn't been fed. torture by rats. So let me just read what it says. Torture that involved the use of rodents was widespread in ancient China. The torture used rats, a cage, and hot coals. According to legend, it was invented in the 16th century by Dietrich Sona, the leader of the Netherlands Revolution. The pendulum. This instrument became popular due to the story of Edgar Poe, The Pit and the Pendulum, 1842. Although the writer claimed that the pendulum was used during the Spanish Inquisition to torture prisoners, there is no historical evidence of this. Impaling people. Impalement. I spin them around. Impaling was one of the most brutal and common executions for spies and prisoners of war and originated in the Dark Ages. In the 15th century, the execution became legendary due to the obsession of the Wallachian prince Vlad Tepes, the real-life inspiration for Dracula. Vlad the Impaler is what they called him, to impale enemies and his own subjects for the slightfulness fault. He used it when he was fighting against the hordes to keep them from overrunning his kingdom. This on. So here you'd sit in a chair, be shackled down, and sit on spikes in your back, holding down your body as you were sitting, and your feet too. The thorn. This was used by inquisitors of the late Middle Ages to interrogate criminals. Curious fact, the legislation that regulated the use of torture allowed the use of the thorn only once during an interrogation, but most inquisitors got around this rule and prolonged the torture for several days under the guise of it only being one session. So you'd hang upside down here on your back, and then there'd be spikes in your back. The chair of inquiries. The chair of inquiries was used to interrogate criminals and heretics during the Inquisition from the Middle Ages through the middle of the 19th century. To make the torture more intense, a fire was started under the seat in the 20th century. Versions of this torture device were used in concentration camps during World War II. Damn, look at those. Torturing shoes. Look at that. Oh man, you really have a bad day there. Clamp them bad boys down on you. On your feet. Let's see what it says. Chair from Cuena. The device was discovered in one of medieval casteels of the city of Cuena, Spain. For a long time, it belonged to Henry Willett, The iron chair is a unique piece of medieval engineering. Using the chair, executioners could conduct an effective interrogation session without using additional tools. Oh, dang, look what it all came with it. The feet. Screw that through your head. Through the top. And then, however, I don't know what this does to your arms. It locks you in somehow. Here's the design of it. Schematic. The electric chair. I don't think the electric chair needs any introduction. Everybody knows what that is. But it says in 1890, the first murderer was executed in the electric chair. During the 20th century, the electric chair was used in 26 states. In recent decades, it has been replaced by other forms of execution. Lethal injection. Example. During its entire history of use, more than 4,300 people were executed in the electric chair. Piercing of your tongue. Says this was a punishment for gossips, slanderers. Like I say, it goes back to gossiping, one of the top sins you could commit. You know, and those who would make fun of statesmen. It was used throughout the world during the Middle Ages. Perhaps this torture was inspired by the innocuous custom of the Aborigines of ancient Oceania to pierce their tongues in order to release evil spirits from it. There's the rack. The use of this device is mentioned during the reigns of Alexander the Great and Emperor Nero. It reached its highest popularity in England and France from the 15th century through to the 17th century. It was primarily used for the interrogation of heretics and traitors. According to one source, the English traitor Guy Fawkes was interrogated on the Strappado before execution. Dang. That'd work you over pretty good. Same thing here, they'd strap you down to a wooden table, wooden bed, and they'd burn the soles of your feet off to make you confess and to purify you from your sins. There's a picture of it. That's what they would do. Oh, here's the rack here, man. Let's strap you this bad boy and stretch you out. Another variation of it. Fork of a heretic. Going through the bottom of your jaw, wrapped around your neck and into your chest. The cat-nine's tail. Whip you with this, tear open your back. Yeah, solid metal too. It'd really tear you open. Wow. Flagellation, whipping with various items, like with rods or sticks, was used from ancient times to the present. This punishment was practiced not only in prisons and hard labor camps, but also in monasteries, educational institutions, and even in private households. 10 to 20 lashes would inflict severe pain and leave scars. Some criminals were even whipped to death. And then the big one, the Sicilian bull. You'd be put inside this thing and roasted alive. Okay, so what it says is, according to legend, this device was built by order of the Sicilian tyrant Phalaris in the second half of the 6th century BC. It was said that Phalaris himself ended up roasted in the bull by rebels. The spectacular form of the death penalty would gain popularity in ancient Rome and Eastern Europe. So they roast you inside of a bronze bull. I guess that's the end. There's the exit right here. So, yeah, they've got a lot of stuff. Like I said, the only thing I didn't see is the jaw and quartering. Other than that, there's a bunch of stuff that I knew about, and then there's a bunch of stuff that I didn't know that was used. So they got a pretty good tool here for educational purposes to see exactly what happened to people that were incarcerated mainly during medieval times. Some of these techniques go back to the ancient world, but most of this stuff was technology that was developed in medieval times. Very cool, very interesting.